The focus of this micro-lecture is forest succession, which is defined as the gradual replacement of one plant community or number of species by another group or cluster species over time. And in a forested ecosystem, succession usually takes place after a disturbance, either a human disturbance or a natural disturbance like fire, a logging event or harvesting, pest outbreaks, and that sort of thing. To understand succession, you need to understand that certain tree species and plant species have a different level of tolerance related to shade and sunlight. You have shade-tolerant species and shade-intolerant species, which basically just have to do with the ability of the tree to grow well in low-light conditions. You can see here these loblolly pine trees are shade intolerant. They need the sun, and you see them kind of recolonizing an old field. And that process is actually called pioneering or pioneer species, those which do come in over recently disturbed areas and set up shop on newly opened up sites. If you've ever walked through a clear cut or a power line right away that hasn't been trimmed in some time, a lot of the species that you'll encounter include multiflora rose, blackberry, yellow poplar, red cedar. Over towards the coast in the Piedmont, you'll run into water oak and other shade-intolerant pioneer species, which are early successional species that get into an area rather quickly and establish themselves and are typically faster growing. Late successional species are typically longer lived and more slow growing. A lot of times your late successional plants kind of hang out in the understory until a disturbance event happens to capitalize on newly found light, or just kind of creep up through the canopy. You have late successional species, but you also have this term applying to late successional forests. In other words, forests that have reached kind of their or have reached their climax, which we'll talk about here in a minute. Tree classification within the canopy is defined or expressed by these four terms. The dominant species in the canopy are the ones that are the ones, the individual trees towering over the other ones. Co-dominant trees make up kind of a similar level in the canopy, where they're all competing for light resources, but not like a tree that ends up being suppressed or dominated by the individual members of the canopy growing above them. And you have some species that are considered intermediate that kind of grow in that mid-level layer in the canopy. So in one of our previous modules we talked about the different layers of the canopy, but you also need to be familiar with the terms related to crown class. When an area is first cleared, or say in the case of a clear cut, what you have typically is a lot of plants regenerating from newly dispersed or buried seeds, which is sometimes called the seed bank. Other times you'll have sprouts from pre-existing stems and roots. A good example of that would be northern red oak, sweet gum, other species that resprout from the existing trunk or stem. And sometimes you end up with advanced regeneration, which are saplings and seedlings that have been growing in the understory and that all of a sudden get released by the influx of light after a clearing. Fraser fir in the mountains, if you've ever been to Roan Mountain or any of the higher mountain areas where Fraser fir naturally grows, you can find some 30 to 60-year-old seedlings that are only 4 to 5 feet tall that have just been waiting for an opening to really get a growth spurt. After that, you end up with the stem exclusion or thinning stage. It goes from the stand initiation stage to the stem exclusion or thinning stage. This is when you have a huge number of stems per acre, and you end up with a lot of thinning going on. A lot of the less tolerant species get shaded out until the ground cover is at a very relatively low level and very little regeneration occurs. There's simply so many individual stems packed into the area that certain stems die, and there's really no room for anything else to grow on the forest floor. Once that original group of kind of dominant trees begins to die, the canopy opens up a little bit more, and other seedlings are able to receive more light. This is called the understory reinitiation or transition stage. You end up with new species coming in. In other words, you'll have some more shade. You'll have shade tolerant and shade intolerant species coexisting, and some of those suppressed individual species are able to get their shot at sunlight. The final stage is the old growth or steady state stage, and that's when there's kind of an equilibrium achieved. This occurs late in the successional process, and the forest is really dominated by what are called gap dynamics. In other words, the forest stays at the canopy stays at a pretty steady state, and species diversity is maintained at a steady state until some kind of disturbance occurs, until an old tree dies or is blown down and another gap is opened, and the cycle at a very small scale takes place again. The shade-tolerant individuals get their opportunity to maximize the new amount of light that's hitting the forest floor, and you end up transitioning into a very uneven age type stand, or even an all age stand if the majority of the species are the same. When you get into the boreal forests, you have those forests that have reached a steady state stage, but they're typically the same species. Whereas here in the mixed mesophytic hardwood forests, you have a variety of different species that form a part of this process. As I mentioned before, the gaps, or as I mentioned gap dynamics before, the gaps and edge effect are disturbances that create an edge along a certain area, or within an older growth stand, or within a forest. Those edges caused by disturbances dictate succession and dictate the type of species diversity coming in there by changing how seeds are dispersed, how light enters a particular area, and also how wind is buffered. And gaps can be caused by a number of different things: road construction, harvesting, natural events like storms, fires, insect outbreaks, etc. are all causes of edges. Urban development, agriculture especially, and even fire can cause those different types of gaps and edge effect, which do dictate succession. Because whereas if you have a pure stand or a forested stand, and say a chunk of it is taken out to put down a house, well, now you have exposed areas of that previously forested area that have their own seed bank. New stem initiation is going to start, but it also allows more light to penetrate those areas around the edges, and sometimes you end up with different species coming up because there is more light, and that's in effect changes the dynamics of the particular forest. In late successional forests, similar to what I talked about, new trees regenerate in these gap areas. Fallen trees due to fire, due to wind throws, due to insects, or simply just due to old age create those new gaps, create those new openings, and allow for different species to move in. On the picture to your right, I believe that's a large wind throw from a storm in Canada. So that opening will allow new seedlings to spring up and reestablish the area. These successional stages also affect wildlife. If you think about a clear cut, or you think about a forested area that's been recently cleared, what kind of animals do you see in those open areas, and why are they there? Typically, after a fire especially, or after a major disturbance, you have new young succulent plant growth coming in, and you have your browsing animals using that area for food. Whereas when the canopy closes, forested areas are used for shelter, used for roosting habitats or nesting areas. While there may be some food production in there, there might be predators. The predator-prey relationship might be a little more defined in those areas, but the point of this was to let you know that there are, forest succession affects not only the tree species but the animal species as well. And a couple more terms to finish off this micro lecture. When referring to stand management and the availability of seeds and seedlings. There's a natural process that seeds have to go through in order to germinate, and one of those terms is stratification, and that's just simply where seeds lie kind of on the forest floor in the cold and damp environment for a whole winter before they germinate in the spring. That's why in artificial forest management or greenhouse operations, if you harvest seeds in the spring, sometimes you pop them in the fridge. It kind of gives them that stratification time. Scarification is just the breakdown of the seed coat through one form or another. Longleaf pine, for example, needs a good fire to wear down that seed coat. Some seeds need to pass through the gut of an animal to wear through that waxy seed coat. So seeds are usually stratified or scarified in order to germinate, and those processes, while normally carried out naturally, can be mimicked in artificial production situations or in greenhouses or for commercial timber production. And again, I have fire noted there, which we will address in another module.